This episode is brought to you by the word imposture and the number 9875. Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the 7th of December 1924, it's a bit of an immigration special. Who came? What did they do? What were the consequences? And what did the government do about it? I'd like to begin with a thank you. Last week I mentioned our tendency, my tendency, to believe media stories even when the media are wrong about things we know about. This tendency has a name, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. It is named in honour of a physicist, although we have Michael Crichton, author of Jurassic Park, to thank for publicising it. Thank you to Grenville Phillips for bringing this to my attention. And now for some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. Giacomo Puccini, the Italian composer, has died. He was the guy responsible for Nessun Dorma. The new Egyptian government has fully accepted the terms of the British ultimatum issued last week in response to the assassination of Lee Stack, the Sirdar. In related news, highly related news, I mentioned last week that there had been a mutiny in Sudan. This has now been put down with the loss of 3 British officers killed. 3 native officers of the Egyptian army were court-martialed and shot. Let's hope we gave them a fair trial before we shot them. A flood in a mine near Swansea has led to the deaths of 5. It has also led to extraordinary tales of heroism from the rescue teams. There has also been an explosion in a pit near Wrexham. That has killed 9, including 3 boys. The school leaving age in those days was 14. There has been a communist uprising in Estonia, which has now been put down. All the evidence is that it was masterminded in the Soviet Union. Great Britain and Germany have signed a trade deal. So much for Britain being a beacon of free trade. The main bone of contention is the provision that German sailors will be allowed to man British merchant ships. Last week I mentioned the case of a man called Robinson suing the Midland Bank for the return of £125,000, which were the proceeds of the blackmail of an Eastern potentate, as the Times puts it. Well, this week the court has found against him. By the way, the Eastern potentate in question will turn out to be Hari Singh, the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. Last week I also mentioned the robbery at Somerset House, involving a man with a false moustache masquerading as an employee of the Bank of England. Well, it turns out, assuming that the police have got the right man, that he was an employee of the Bank of England. The motive would appear to be that staple of detective novels, gambling debts. The City and South London Line, renamed the City Line, nowadays the Northern Line, has been reopened after the tunnels were enlarged. The first train through the reopened line was driven by the daughter of Lord Ashfield, chairman of the United Electric Railways of London. Traffic congestion caused by the increased use of vehicles powered by internal combustion engines continues to get worse. The Home Secretary, no less, has suggested that new roads be built through London's parks. Absolutely no one has pointed out that congestion is a consequence of the lack of a market in road space. In a victory for common sense, a proposal for the London County Council to start a river bus service has been rejected. I've said it before, it sounds sensible to use the river for transport, but it always loses money. On Tuesday, the Times reported that a man who had been found ill on the pavement and claimed not to have eaten for a week had subsequently died. It was not clear if he had failed to go to the workhouse due to pride or ignorance. On Saturday we learnt that 1 million wireless licences had been issued over the course of the previous 12 months. In real life, immigration is an issue just about everywhere in the Western world. It was also an issue in 1924, so much so that the Times published a series of articles from a special correspondent looking at the issue. I regret to say that I haven't had the time to read the first 2, too much time spent on the doings of Chicago's gangsters, but I have been able to read parts 3 and 4. I find them fascinating, and I hope listeners will indulge me as I read out large chunks of them. The presence of an un-Anglicized or only partially Anglicized population of recent alien origin in the East End is a source of perpetual surprise to the West Enders who from time to time make voyages of discovery beyond Aldgate. The middle classes being out of touch with the working classes. That has a familiar ring to it. Surprise often begets uncritical alarm, whence arise the rumours now so prevalent of an unrestricted influx of aliens who compete with the British workmen. Facts do not support this legend. They really don't, as we shall discover. But given the existence of large numbers of non-British workers, whether naturalised or unnaturalised in this country, I have to confess I'm not sure what naturalised means, then or now. Nowadays it appears to be a stepping stone towards citizenship. I guess it was then, but I could be wrong. It is natural that those who have the interest of the British workman at heart should ask the following questions. Has immigrant labour injured British labour by its competition? Have the immigrants directly or indirectly lowered the standards of life of the native population? Are the present restrictions on their entry efficacious? Do alien unemployed tend to become a burden on the public purse to a relatively greater extent than British unemployed? He is asking almost exactly the same questions we asked today. The only one missing is over ethnic/sectarian conflict, which in my humble opinion should get asked more than it does. Strap in. Some of these questions will get an answer. The first question can at present be answered in the negative. The large industries in which unemployment is most rife, dock and harbour services, shipbuilding, certain classes of metal manufacture and metal trades, do not employ aliens to any important extent, while the trades and industries such as tailoring, mantle making, that's the thing that goes over a fireplace, cabinet making, confectionery making, in which many Italians are employed, which are most patronised by aliens, are not in such bad case, though they show a considerable percentage of unemployed. In London, cheap tailoring and mantle-making has been largely developed by alien labour since 1881. I wonder what's so special about 1881. Anyway, he goes on. Before that date, if old residents in the East End are to be believed, few of the poorer British working men could afford to buy new clothes. A certain number of small native tailors were no doubt driven out of business by the immigrants who substituted machine work for handwork, and by the extreme subdivision of labour, economised time and skill, and were able to put a passable article on the market at greatly reduced prices. When I first read that, I read it as machines being supplanted by cheap labour, the Industrial Revolution in reverse. But reading it a second time, it's clear that our immigrants were using machines and specialisation to make the process much more efficient. There are certain industries in which foreigners are largely employed owing to their special aptitude. Thus, briar pipe makers are mostly Frenchmen from the French Jura, while scientific glassblowers usually come from Amsterdam. Such industries would disappear if the foreigners from time to time engaged were prohibited from entering this country. He then talks about the influx of French and Italians into hospitality. Some of this may have a very familiar ring. The bigger hotels and restaurants say that they cannot get the men in this country, and it certainly seems that the obsequious deference of manner which some managers and patrons of hotels demand is not natural to the British youth, and that he is unwilling to go into the kitchen at the age of 15 as a French boy will, and work up from marmiton to chef. Attempts at exchange with foreign countries are often defeated by the Englishman's self-consciousness. He dreads the idea of going abroad to be laughed at, as he needlessly fears, for his ignorance of the language, while the young Italian dashes off to take a job in London without knowing a word of English, under any employer, with the firm determination to own a restaurant by the end of his career. Meanwhile, the Italian who resides in the country is usually a quiet, well-conducted being whose chief fault is his tendency to crowd himself and his employees into a very small living place when he opens his first small restaurant. He is as sober as the Eastern Jew and as thrifty. I wonder what he's serving in this restaurant. I was told that Britons did not take to Italian or any other cuisine until the 1960s. Before then it was dismissed as foreign muck, but maybe not. Our special correspondent then goes on to talk about housing. The invasion of the East End by aliens, who did not dislike crowding in insanitary houses, did undoubtedly lower the standards of the surrounding British population. Familiar enough. It was as difficult to build houses then as it is now, but for completely different reasons. At present, overcrowding among Jews and Gentiles is again rife for reasons given in the previous article, namely the shortage of houses. But one gathers that a far smaller proportion of the Jewish population of the East End is content to live in squalor than was once the case. That they were ready to work for a pittance, and when they became masters themselves, to sweat their co-religionists is historical. But the growth of trade unionism, such legislation as the Trade Boards Act, and the cessation of the supply of greeners, i.e. raw immigrants whom the small masters themselves, perhaps only domiciled for 2 or 3 years in this country, snapped up as soon as they arrived, have greatly diminished sweating among them, and its survival is furtive and comparatively rare. At the same time, any unrestricted influx of Jews from the ghettos of Eastern Europe would inevitably revive it. I'm not sure that there is any clear definition of sweated labour. I guess it is hours and conditions that the observer dislikes. The Trade Boards Act appears to create minimum wages in certain industries. He then goes on to describe the legal situation. A great deal of ignorance prevails as to the conditions under which alien labour is now imported into Great Britain. In no circumstances is an alien allowed to land in Great Britain to search for work. The would-be employer of an alien, whether he requires a French governess for his children, a German correspondent for his office, or a Dutch glassblower for his works, has first to obtain permission from the Minister of Labour. The Minister does not give the necessary permission until he is completely satisfied that the applicant has taken all possible steps to find labour in this country, that he will pay the alien no less wages than those usually received by British employees for similar work. This is a goodie. That he is prepared to repatriate the alien if required so to do, and that no labour will be displaced by the engagement of the foreigner in question. I would wager a small sum of money that, with the exception of the bit about repatriation, the official situation is much the same today, although, as we shall see, the results are very different. In some cases, when men of exceptional technical skill who cannot be engaged in this country are required, the Minister insists upon an undertaking that the imported workman shall train a British workman to take his place on the expiry of his engagement. In many cases a time limit is imposed, after which the foreigner must return home, with the liability to punishment, plus expulsion if he refuses. The restrictions imposed make it virtually impossible to smuggle foreign labour into the country. One can just imagine how this might have applied in a more recent time to curry chefs. I may add that had any relaxation of the restrictions been proposed by the late government, i.e. the Labour government, it would have been condemned by large numbers of British trade unionists. Now, there's a sign of the times. Witness the anxiety shown by the British Seafarers' Union at the prospect that German seamen and stewards may be allowed to ship on British vessels at a time when a large number of British seafaring men are unemployed. In talking about immigrant politics, he comes up with this beauty. The desire to open the country to fugitives from capitalist oppression, evinced by certain mainly Jewish groups, is not shared by the average British workman, and appears to be inspired by political motives, of which more will be said on another occasion. Where does one start with that? First of all, capitalism is a Marxist phrase. I prefer the term freedom, but if we just stick to the economic term free markets, it seems odd to flee from free markets to somewhere with freer markets. The article then reveals that there had been an excess of 9,875 arrivals over departures for the year ending the 30th of September. In real life, the figure for last year, that is 2023, was about 750,000. He then goes on to talk about welfare. Unemployment, though considerable, is less disastrously prevalent among the East End aliens than among the British population. Unfortunately, there are grounds for the assertion that a section of the alien Jewish community is both more ready to accept relief from the local boards of guardians and less scrupulous in its claims than are the British working people. Officers and members of much more than one board of guardians have informed me that in their opinion the great majority, one very experienced officer gave the proportion as 80%, of the British play straight with them, that the percentage among the alien Jews is lower, and that their secretiveness and reluctance to disclose imposture among their fellows make it extremely difficult for the guardians to discover whether the pathetic recipient of relief is not really making money as a street hawker or otherwise in a different quarter. Imposture means impersonation. And then our correspondent negates everything he just wrote. At the same time, the number of unnaturalized aliens in receipt of relief is not proportionately excessive. Might I dare to suggest that if you are brought up in a society where honesty is a passport to a short life, you might not be very good at it, even if you find yourself in a society where it is rewarded. On Thursday, the correspondent turned his attention to health, politics, and crime. For some time much attention has been devoted to the physical condition of the inhabitants of our cities, and among them of the immigrants who have settled principally but not exclusively in London during the last 40 years. A nation has every right to insist on the fulfilment of certain physiological conditions by would-be immigrants. Take a court in East London, where 12 small houses crowded with poor Jews have a single tap for their water supply and a single privy near it, and picture the result of the entry of a carrier of typhoid or dysentery. One does wonder who is maintaining that privy. He then talks about politics. Many of the Jews and the children of the Jews who have entered London from Eastern Europe since the beginning of this century are supporters of the Labour Party and usually call themselves socialists. There are a fair number of communists among them who attack the official Labour Party as ferociously as they inveigh against the capitalist. But, pace Mrs. Webster and other alarming writers, it is by no means certain that the Jew in this country, or any other where he has not been subjected to political or social disabilities, has any natural predisposition in favour of revolutionary or even evolutionary socialism. This Mrs. Webster was probably Nestor Webster, a promoter of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. But there is an important point here. There is nothing in Judaism that commands its adherents to make war on the native population. Violent crime is rare in the mainly Jewish quarters of the East End, and has decreased generally in that part of London, though Hoxton, which is only partly Jewish, has a bad reputation. On the other hand, the more recently arrived alien still has a bad name for untruthfulness and commercial dishonesty. Lest I should be accused of prejudice, I may quote a passage from The Jew in London, written by a Jew in 1900. One is sometimes tempted to conclude in despair that the bulk of Polish immigrants have no sense of truth whatever. No more painful spectacle can be witnessed than the hearing of a summons at an East End police court where the parties concerned are foreign Jews. Obvious perjury on the smallest provocation is committed in case after case. I fear it cannot be denied that their standard of business morality is often defective. But Jews are not the only aliens. Unfortunately, our correspondent uses terms that are nowadays archaic and would appear to incur the displeasure of the YouTube gods. So you're just going to have to guess. The when he takes to crime, generally cocaine smuggling or the opening of a clandestine opium den, is resourceful and daring, but has not yet broken out in the grand style foreshadowed in Mr. Sax Rohmer's tales. Sax Rohmer was the author of the Fu Manchu stories. There is a colony near the Tottenham Court Road, which give the police some trouble, but many of its members claim to be British West Indians. I'm not quite sure about the significance of the but. Could he mean that as they are citizens of the Empire they cannot be regarded as aliens? The alien political criminal has done nothing serious since the war, and the really desperate men of the type of the Latvian, anarchists who committed the crimes which led to the siege of Sydney Street, this is of 1911, have probably been drawn away by the superior attractions of Bolshevist Russia. One can but hope. Anyway, that's all for this week. If you got this far, congratulations. I hope it was as interesting to you as it was to me. As always, I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.